You can make your family's life much brighter. You will find your work much lighter.
It's easy to think of the late 50s as a time of great innocence.
Live better electrically.
But it simply isn't true. The Soviet Union, using Fidel Castro as a front, was knocking on America's back door. Revolutionary social movements were on the way, and an era of judicial activism was beginning. The First Amendment of our Constitution was about to be reinterpreted in a way our founders never intended. The Supreme Court would overstep its constitutional bounds and begin to make law rather than interpret it. Great changes were about to take place.
In 1960, when I was 14 years old, my mother, Madeline Murray O'Hare, was already one of the nation's most militant atheists and a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. She had twice attempted to defect to the Soviet Union. After several unsuccessful attempts in the United States, she even traveled to Paris, France, in a fruitless effort to appeal here to the Soviet consulate. Uprooted from everything that was familiar, my brief stay here was unsettling, but not nearly as chaotic as what would soon follow.
I am fighting for my right to have freedom of conscience, to live in the way that I want to live in a basic, to live with a philosophy, and to live in a way based on that philosophy, the philosophy of atheism, the philosophy of love of fellow man rather than love of God.
My mother enrolled me here at Woodburn after returning from Paris. Here, at this unassuming place, she would put the Constitution to the test. In the process, she would raise many questions about the relationship between church and state, questions we still wrestle with today. When I was a student here, prayer in public school was taken for granted. Every school day began with a Pledge of Allegiance, prayer, and sometimes a Bible reading. There was nothing unusual about it. Prayer in public schools had been going on for as long as there had been public schools. It wasn't even controversial, much less illegal, but not for long. My mother's unsuccessful attempt at defection had only intensified her perpetually angry mood. The school year had already begun, and as we walked down the halls, classes were in session. The sound of prayers and the voices of students reading from the Bible emanated from the classrooms as we passed by. Our centuries-old tradition of school prayer infuriated my mother. As she enrolled me in school, she took the opportunity to confront the counselor about what she considered to be an unacceptable promotion of religion in school. My mother was no diplomat and did her best to browbeat the school counselor. Her anger was vented in a rush of obscenities that rocked the counselor back in his chair. I stood and kept my mouth shut, as I always did when my mother was on the rampage. A few days later, on Saturday afternoon, my mother told me about her plan to pressure school officials to excuse me from class during the morning prayer and Bible reading. My mother loved confrontations, and she never hesitated to use me as an accomplice in her schemes. She wanted to push the school prayer issue as far as she could, so she instructed me to keep a record of prayer and Bible reading at school. It was here in my home my mother made me a spy for the cause of atheism. On October 12th, my mother called school district headquarters and spoke to the superintendent, Vernon Vavrina. She demanded that I be excused for morning prayer, a request Vavrina declined. My mother, not one to take no for an answer, decided to keep me home indefinitely in the hope of escalating the tension. 2 days later, she received a written notice of truancy. My mother, misguided but no fool, had exactly what she wanted, a confrontation. She made the most of it. On October 26th, she was contacted by reporter Stephen Nordlinger of the Baltimore Sun. The next day, the Sun ran an article about my mother and me. I was quoted as saying, as an atheist, I shouldn't be subjected to prayer and Bible reading in order to get a free public education. On Wednesday, school prayer was a non-issue in the popular media. By Friday, it was national news.
Bill, why did you leave Woodburn School?
Well, you had to say every morning the Lord's Prayer and also the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, which has in it, under God we trust, or something like that. And it was just ridiculous because I am I think I am an atheist, and I wish to be an atheist, and I don't feel that it would be appropriate for me to stand up and say the Lord's Prayer or to say this religio-patriotic thing of under God we trust.
Were you required to do this at the school?
Yes, we were. Every morning one person would read from the Bible, and you would have to say the Lord's Prayer and pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States.
Do you feel that this is a violation of your personal rights?
I think it's not only a violation of my personal rights, but it is also a violation of the Constitution of the United States of America.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill Murray.
You're welcome.
After the Sun article, the street in front of my home became a gauntlet. My mother knew how to manipulate the media, and my story immediately became the focus of national attention. NBC, CBS, and ABC television all requested interviews. My mother was ecstatic. Hoping to milk every ounce of publicity from the situation, she decided I should return to school, this time with television cameras following me. On October 28th, at about 7:30 a.m., I arrived at Woodburn School to the taunts of my fellow students who shouted at me, "Commie lover." I had been followed by reporters and film crews in cars. I was 14 years old, confused and terrified. I was met at these school steps by a counselor who escorted me to the principal's office.
The principal, unprepared for the controversy, the crowd of reporters, and the confused teenagers sitting in her office, had contacted the superintendent. The superintendent had consulted with the school board, and eventually the controversy worked its way up to the Attorney General's office.
1 week later, from here in his office, C. Ferdinand Seibert, Attorney General of Maryland, affirmed the school prayer was constitutional and recommended that students who found the practice offensive remain silent or be excused from class while prayer was conducted. My mother was not daunted. She seldom was. Retaining an attorney, she filed legal papers here with the Superior Court of Baltimore City on December 7th. In her petition, she asked that all illegal prayer and Bible reading cease. In January 1961, after the Christmas holidays, the school district filed a reply. 8 weeks later, on March 2nd, Judge Gilbert J. Pendergrass dismissed my mother's petition.
Again, undaunted, my mother filed an appeal with the state's highest court, the Maryland Court of Appeals, here in Annapolis. As Russia began to arm Cuba, my mother, the chair of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, was receiving thousands of dollars from other atheists and using the money to publish her monthly magazine, The American Atheist. The ongoing court battle continued to generate publicity for my mother. She had become known as America's most outspoken advocate for removing all vestiges of religion from public life, a cause she considered central to her communist agenda.
In spite of her treatment by the Soviet embassy, my mother's interest in the Communist Party went unabated. In the spring, she brought me here to visit the headquarters of the Communist Party in New York to drum up support for her new cause. In spite of their working-class propaganda, the headquarters looked like a wealthy corporate office. To her chagrin, they did little to support her.
A few months after the first Russian had orbited the Earth and the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, my mother's petition was argued before the Maryland Court of Appeals. My mother's attorney, Leonard Kerpelman, presented her case.
The Murray case reached the United States Supreme Court after the Superior Court of Baltimore City and the Maryland Court of Appeals had declared public school Bible reading and recitation of the Lord's Prayer a constitutional practice.
Early on February 26, 1963, my mother awoke me and we drove to Washington, D.C. Here, at the Supreme Court at 9:30 a.m., the debate on the case began. Nothing less than the reinterpretation of the First Amendment of the Constitution was at stake.
2 days ago, June 17th, the final day of the present session, the decision was handed down. Justice Tom Clark, on behalf of 8 judges, wrote the majority opinion from which Professor Van Doren now reads.
Once again, we are called upon to consider the scope of the provision of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which declares that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In light of the history of the First Amendment and of our cases interpreting and applying its requirements, we hold that the practices at issue and the laws requiring them are unconstitutional under the Establishment Clause.
The justices, ruling 8-1, had ruled that prayer and Bible reading in America's schools was unconstitutional.